The South Coast Air Quality Management District, or AQMD as it's known, is one of the largest environmental regulatory agencies in the United States. AQMD is responsible for regulating air quality all throughout massive Southern California, safeguarding its 25 million residents from toxic pollution. The Port of Long Beach in SoCal is one of the world's busiest ports and the second largest port in the U.S. The Port of LB is located in San Pedro Bay next to the Port of LA, and the two ports combined are the largest gateways for trade in North America, handling a whopping 40% of all cargo. So why are the Port of Long Beach and the AQMD, these two behemoth powers, seemingly at war with each other these days? You're about to find out. The Port of Long Beach, located in Los Angeles County, about 25 miles south of downtown LA, is a massive gateway of trade for the U.S. and the world. Over 3,000 acres of land, over 30 miles of waterfront, handling millions of cargo containers and billions of dollars of goods each year. It's possible your furniture, computers, electronics, your cars, the gasoline you use, all pass through the Port of Long Beach. There are 22 shipping terminals here, including 6 container terminals, which account for most of the port's business. Tens of thousands of containers stacked out here all over the port each day, ready to ship overseas or hauled inland. So it's no wonder that with all the port's mobile sources, things like ships, cargo containers, tugboats, trucks, forklifts, pipelines, to haul everything from one place to another, well, there's going to be some air pollution out here and throughout the surrounding LA County communities. All ports throughout the U.S. and the world are guilty of being some of the worst polluters on planet Earth. That's just a fact. It's to be expected. Unfortunately, the collateral damage, according to studies from many doctors and researchers, demonstrates that people living near ports can have higher rates of medical conditions like asthma, cancer, heart problems, with all the diesel fuel exhaust and toxic emissions getting into the air, causing the black soot and smog that can get into your lungs. That's why the South Coast Air Quality Management District, the environmental regulatory agency also known as AQMD, is developing their Indirect Source Rule, or ISR, this to reduce air pollution emanating from the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. AQMD is concerned about all the pollution out here, and their new rule is basically intended to reduce emissions from all mobile sources. Port officials are greatly opposed to AQMD's Indirect Source Rule for what they say is the collateral damage the ISR could cause. Thomas Yelenich is with the Pacific Merchant Shipping Association, or PMSA as it's known. PMSA is a trade association that represents the companies employing the port labor. For example, marine terminal operators and ocean carriers all throughout the U.S. West Coast, including here in Southern California at the ports of LA and Long Beach.
California has set a clear goal to get to zero emissions for basically all sources of air pollution. Here in the port complex, we've been working on that goal for over 20 years. Our members have been working with port authorities, technology developers, agencies like the South Coast Air Quality Management District and the California Air Resources Board, trying to make that future a reality. I think in California, that future is probably going to be a combination of battery electric technologies and hydrogen technologies. PMSA's concern is to make sure that this transition happens in a way that also preserves the economic vitality of the Southern California and California ports. We have reduced diesel emissions by 91%. That success has come about through collaboration. It is the collaborative focus of projects like the Clean Air Action Plan, partnership with port authorities, partnership with regulatory agencies that allow us to successfully reduce emissions. In fact, there's a Nikola truck, which is a great example of zero emissions technology being deployed here in the port complex. And all of the success has been through a collaborative process. And what the proposed Rule 2304, or the Indirect Source Rule, whatever you want to call it, what it does is it abandons the collaborative approach that has made this port complex an environmental success story.
Yelenich says he's concerned that the AQMD Indirect Source Rule, the ISR, in its well-intentioned efforts to rid the pollution out here at the port, is going to have serious economic consequences. He says there are going to be overwhelming financial impacts that the Indirect Source Rule could create. Yelenich insists the collaborative approach to rid pollution out here is working, and AQMD, in his words, is trying to implement a new go it alone, my way, or the highway plan.
The first thing that it will do is potentially freeze the collaborative spirit that we've had in the port complex. It is that work that has allowed us to achieve the success we have. In the longer term, depending on what gets proposed, we could see caps on emissions, caps on cargo. That is deeply concerning. That would impact not just the port complex, but our surrounding communities, which the workers here live in. Now we're looking at an agency that's 50 miles away is going to be dictating what port planning looks like.
Yelenich claims the AQMD ISR, if all goes AQMD's way as planned, is going to cost the port a fortune for all the zero-emission changeovers. He says the ISR is going to devastate the local and state economy, have a negative impact on jobs, a negative impact on the nation's supply chain. Yelenich believes the ISR is unfairly going to cap the amount of goods coming through the LA Long Beach Gateway, possibly even limit the ability of California farmers to export their products, as well as creating delays in shipping. This is unacceptable, says Yelenich, especially since the Port of Long Beach already has implemented what he says is a success story with regards to their environmental plan of action.
PMSA's members, the marine terminal operators, the ocean carriers, they're deploying new technology every single day. They're spending millions of dollars every single day trying to advance this technology. And we're simply disappointed that AQMD does not want to work in a collaborative fashion with us. It has been a success story that has set a model for the entire world within the maritime industry. And we hope they return to working with us. It is the one way we know we can be successful here.
The Port of Long Beach and the Port of LA are certainly aware that they are one of the region's biggest polluters. Heather Tomley knows that. Tomley is the Managing Director of Planning and Environmental Affairs for the Port of Long Beach. She is the port's environmental guru, you could say.
So we take our position in the city very seriously. We recognize that it's important for us to be a good neighbor for the local communities and to make sure that we're addressing the environmental impacts that are associated with port operations.
What are some of the concerns, the complaints, the voices that you've heard over the years?
So historically, the equipment that's used in port operations is fueled by diesel. A lot of the trucks that drive through the neighborhoods, a lot of the vessel emissions, what that means for air quality, and if enough is being done to reduce the pollutions. We recognize that that's an important role that we have, but it's also important to understand how we fit in with the region. And so each year we do an emissions inventory. We keep track of what the emissions are that are coming from all of the different sources that are operating here. And we can compare that against the emissions that are happening throughout the entire region. Port of Long Beach is about 3 to 5% of the regional emissions that are happening. Together with Port of LA, they're about equivalent to us. So more than 90% of the emissions that are happening throughout the whole region are not port related.
Heather Tomley says the Port of Long Beach is very proactively trying to reduce toxic emissions. And although Tomley admits this has been a tough task, she says they're witnessing success these days, especially after finally identifying many of the pollution problems several years ago.
20 years ago, the Port of Long Beach recognized that cargo was increasing and that we needed to do more to address the environmental impacts that were associated with that. So in 2005, Port of Long Beach adopted our Green Port policy. And that was really in recognition that we needed to do more to be a good neighbor. We needed to be addressing water quality concerns, sediment quality concerns. We needed to be addressing our communication and engagement with the community. In addition to that, a big part of it was what we needed to do to address air quality concerns. So the following year, in 2006, we partnered with Port of Los Angeles and we developed our Clean Air Action Plan.
Part of identifying those port operations within the Clean Air Action Plan is this backdrop where I'm interviewing Heather Tomley. This massive vessel out here at the Long Beach Port Terminal in the background was one of the first places port officials implemented what's known as green leases. This to help reduce pollution in part with usage of a shore power requirement.
when the vessels come in at berth, they plug into electric power and they shut down their engines on board. And that's been a really incredible technology to help reduce emissions from ships while they're in berth. Today, all of the container terminals throughout the port have that technology installed. So when the ships come in, they shut down their engines and they stop polluting.
So simply put, no exhaust is leaving these ships while they're docked here and sitting here.
That's correct. So we plug in the vessels and they can shut down their engines and be running off of clean electric power. Also on vessels, for more than the 2 decades, we've been working on a voluntary program with the shipping lines. When they depart and arrive at the port, they slow down from 40 nautical miles off the shore, and that reduces the load on the engine, reduces the pollution that's produced by those engines, and that's been a really effective program. We also have had programs over the years. We help to incentivize early use of cleaner, low sulfur fuel and provided some incentives for that, and that eventually became a statewide regulation. We're recognizing we need to not just reduce pollution, but we need to work to eliminate pollution. And so over the coming, 5, 10 plus years, we're looking to completely convert all of that equipment to zero emissions. So we've been working on incentive programs, we've been working on technology development projects and demonstrations. We now have more than 500 zero emission trucks that are operating on a daily basis in and out of this port hauling cargo. We also have nearly a fifth of all of the trucks and the terminal equipment that operates here daily, that's also zero emission.
Do you believe you folks get a bad rap with some of the pollution narrative, or is some of the criticism fair?
We recognize the port is a large source of emissions, and that's why it's important for us to continue to do the work that we're doing to try to reduce those emissions. We are working as fast as we can with the technologies that are feasible today to get them implemented and do the work that we need to so that we can convert to zero emission operations in the terminals by 2030 and for on-road trucks by 2035.
Thank you to the Port of Long Beach for the interviews and allowing us to tour their facility. Now joining us to hear the other argument is Dr. Sarah Reese with South Coast AQMD. Dr. Reese is the Deputy Executive Officer of Planning, Rural Development, and Implementation. Dr. Reese, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We have a lot to discuss. I want to hear your arguments. Certainly, as you know, the Port of Long Beach is not happy with your AQMD ISR, your Indirect Source Rule. So before we discuss all that, Dr. Reese, tell our audience, where are we at now with the ISR? In other words, what stage are you at? What is next on the agenda?
Sure. Well, we've actually been working with the ports for many, many years on this issue. We started way back in 2017, at the time trying to get a voluntary agreement with the ports together to get have them agree to get the emission reductions associated with the actions in their Clean Air Action Plan, which is their own plan on how they were going to get to clean air. For a variety of reasons, that didn't work out. We've been in rulemaking for the last few years, and right now we've been talking actively with all the different stakeholders in industry, in the public, and the community, and have plans to bring this rule to our board for consideration in August of this year.
Let's talk about what the folks I interviewed are saying with the Port of Long Beach. I know you've heard this story before. They're saying, quote, AQMD is abandoning what was once sort of this collaborative effort, as you mentioned earlier, to work with the port, the stakeholders, the boots on the ground folks, the folks you mentioned. But they're now saying, Dr. Reese, you're kind of going it alone. You're, in your opinion, and to be fair to them, is there any merit to their argument of them insisting you're going it alone?
It's a little hard to say how we're going it alone. When we go through a rulemaking process, we do that in a very open and transparent way. We have multiple working group meetings where we invite stakeholders from industry, from community groups, from environmental organizations, the whole gamut of stakeholders to work with us to hear, we lay out the objectives of what we need to accomplish. We ask for input, we ask for feedback. And that's really why we're focusing on the current concept we have in our Indirect Source Rule. Through through multiple meetings, we heard a common theme, which is if you're going to pivot towards zero emission technologies, cleaner technologies, the linchpin in all of this is getting the infrastructure in place, making appropriate, comprehensive infrastructure plans across the port complex so that you're able to power these new pieces of equipment when they come into place. Getting a zero emission truck is no good if you have no place to plug it in. Getting a cleaner ocean-going vessel that's fueled by alternative fuels is no good if it can't fuel at our ports. And so this is really, we heard this theme a lot. And so that's why we are putting this concept out to require the ports to do the comprehensive infrastructure planning, to lay out the timelines of that. We understand this is a huge undertaking. We stand in partnership with the ports to help work through all of this. But it's a first and much needed step, and the thing that we need to have in place so that we can ultimately facilitate getting this cleaner equipment in place that we all agree we need.
So furthering that narrative of what you're saying, and no one's going to argue it is a Herculean effort, you've heard the criticism. Let me kind of set the stage a little bit of this, because as you know, the Port of Long Beach says they're greatly concerned about these new regs. It's going to cost them an insane amount of money. You just said it's going to be extraordinarily expensive. It's going to hurt the local and state economy. It's going to have a devastating impact on the jobs, according to them, an impact on the supply chain. They even say it's going to cap the amount of goods, So what do you say to all of their criticism? Because they say they've got a case to be made as well.
Honestly, it is a little puzzling, because what we're requiring in this rule is that the ports work with us and develop the plan effectively to meet the goals that they've already stated they're going to make, right? In their Clean Air Action Plan, they already say they're going to go to 100% zero emission technology for cargo handling equipment by 2030. That's not that far away. They're going to go to 100% zero emission trucks by 2035. So all we're asking is that they work and put together this comprehensive plan showing the work as to how they're going to get there, lay that out, have timelines in place. There's relief valves, so if they plan to do something and for whatever reason beyond their control it doesn't work out, they have a relief valve for that. But we feel it's really important to get started on this work, because it is going to take so much effort and so much resource to pull together, and it's something that everybody agrees needs to be done, so let's get started on it.
We're going to talk about solutions in just a moment. Just to sidetrack just a bit, I interview so many folks on this program, liberals, conservatives, Dems, Republicans, business folks, environmental folks. Don't you notice, Dr. Reese, there's always sort of this divide somewhere for whatever reason between the environmentalists and the business interests. I don't know why that is. It just seems like no one can sort of get together and speak the same language, right? There seems to be always a disconnect between the enviros and the business folks. And I just encounter it every week on this program. We interview folks. It seems there's just not that alignment that we want with everybody. I'm not sure. And I'm not necessarily saying I'm pro-enviro, I'm pro-business. I'm somewhere in the middle, to be honest. I'm very centrist. I mean, in other words, I get that we don't want to kill jobs, right? We want opportunity. We want business. We want the economy to be good in Southern California, the state of California, and LA. On the other hand, we don't want dirty, filthy, horrible air, but there's got to be a way that we can all sort of bridge towards the middle and work with some common ground. What that is, I'm not sure yet. Maybe you have an idea or an opinion.
Well, I think, frankly, that's exactly the kind of work that we do. And let me reiterate that, our current requirement in the Indirect Source Rule, it would not have an impact on jobs. It would not have any limitation on cargo or any detrimental impacts. That it's simply a requirement to do the planning that the ports say they're already going to do anyway. But we pride ourselves, when we go through the rulemaking process, of really listening closely to stakeholders and crafting practical solutions to get the emission reductions we need, but still facilitate economic growth. And if you look over the last several decades in our region, population has increased, jobs have increased, GDP has increased dramatically, and we've still been able to get those emission reductions to keep going down and make progress towards where we need to be.